You ever notice how people think they own the water until the water stops flowing? The first thing I smelled that morning wasn't coffee. It was chemicals. Sharp, bitter, the kind of smell that doesn't belong anywhere near a lake. I stepped out onto the old cedar dock behind my house, boots thudding against the weathered boards my father nailed down 30 years ago, and the air felt wrong. Still, heavy. The lake that had been part of my family longer than most of the houses in this county looked like someone had drained the life right out of it. The surface was cloudy, a pale gray film stretching across the water where it should have been clear enough to see the rocks 20 feet down. A couple of bass floated near the reeds, drifting slowly with the morning breeze. I stood there for a long moment, hands on the railing, trying to convince myself it was algae or runoff from the storm the night before. But the smell told a different story. That sour chemical bite hit the back of my throat every time the wind shifted. And then I saw the sign. Bright white. Brand new. Staked right into the grass beside my dock, like someone planting a flag. No fishing. HOA environmental control. I actually laughed when I read it. Not because it was funny. Because it was unbelievable. My name is Daniel Carter, and that lake sitting behind my house isn't some decorative pond the neighborhood association gets to manage. My grandfather dug the first basin of it back in 1964 with a rented bulldozer and a stubborn streak that ran through our family like bedrock. He used to tell me the land here held water if you treated it right. Said the hill runoff would feed the basin and the clay soil would seal it like a bowl. Turned out he was right. What started as a muddy cattle pond grew over the decades into a 40-acre lake that outlived the farm, outlived the old ranch house, and somehow ended up surrounded by a subdivision full of manicured lawns and identical mailboxes. Willow Creek Estates. Rows of beige houses with 2-car garages and HOA newsletters that read like rulebooks for breathing. Most of the people who live there see the lake as scenery. Something pretty to look at from their patios while they sip iced tea. But to me, it's family history. I learned how to fish right off this dock when I was 6 years old. My dad taught me how to read the water by the ripple patterns. My grandfather used to sit out here every Sunday morning with a dented metal tackle box and a thermos of black coffee that smelled strong enough to wake the entire county. This lake isn't just water. It's the one thing in this neighborhood that hasn't changed. At least it hadn't until the HOA president decided it was a problem. Her name is Linda Whitmore. Drives a pearl white Lexus SUV and walks around with a clipboard like she's running a military inspection. Linda moved into Willow Creek Estates 5 years ago, and within 12 months, she'd turned the homeowners association into her personal kingdom. Grass height violations, fence color citations, letters about trash cans being left out 6 minutes too long. I'd mostly ignored her. My property sits just outside the official HOA boundary line, and that fact seemed to bother her more than anything else. She'd stood on this very dock 2 months ago pointing across the water like she owned the horizon. Said my fishing boat disrupted the aesthetic harmony of the neighborhood. I remember the exact words because I'd never heard anyone complain about a fishing boat hurting property values before. Now here I was staring at poison water and a sign claiming the HOA controlled my lake. And the strange part wasn't the arrogance. It was the stupidity. Because if Linda Whitmore and her HOA board really believed this lake was just my private fishing hole, then they had absolutely no idea where their drinking water came from. I walked the shoreline slowly, boots sinking into the damp clay where the waterline had crept back a few inches overnight. The smell was stronger here. Bitter and artificial, the kind of scent that reminded me of the cleaning aisle in a hardware store. Whatever had been dumped into the lake was not natural runoff, and anyone who had spent more than 5 minutes around water would know it. I crouched down near the edge and watched the small ripples lap against the mud. This lake had always been clear enough that you could see the shadows of bluegill darting through the reeds. Now the surface looked dull and tired, like someone had drained the color out of it. For a second, I closed my eyes and pictured the way this place used to look when I was a kid. My grandfather would wake me before sunrise on summer mornings, the screen door slamming softly behind us as we stepped out into the cool air. The grass would still be wet with dew, and the lake would sit quiet and glassy under the first light of day. He used to say water had a memory. Said if you took care of it, it would take care of you right back. Back then the land around here was nothing but open pasture and a few gravel roads winding through cedar trees. You could drive 10 minutes in any direction and never see another house. But that changed about 20 years ago when developers discovered the hills west of town. The farms slowly disappeared, replaced by subdivisions with names that sounded like resorts. Willow Creek Estates was one of the biggest. Perfect rows of houses, identical driveways, and carefully planted maple trees that looked like they had been measured with a ruler. The developers loved advertising the lake in their brochures. I remember the signs when the first phase opened. Lakefront living, scenic water views. They built their whole marketing campaign around a body of water that my family had dug with a bulldozer and a lot of stubborn patience. What most of the new homeowners never bothered to learn was that the lake was never part of the subdivision. The property line ran along the eastern ridge, right where the dock sat. Everything beyond that ridge belonged to my family long before Willow Creek Estates even existed. That fact had never sat well with the Homeowners Association, especially not with Linda Whitmore. The first time she knocked on my door, she had introduced herself with that tight professional smile people use when they already expect you to cooperate. She stood there holding a stack of printed papers explaining community standards and neighborhood guidelines. I remember the faint smell of expensive perfume drifting across the porch as she talked about maintaining the character of the area. According to Linda, the lake created a problem. She said fishing boats and tackle gear made the neighborhood look rustic. Rustic. That was the exact word she used, like it was some kind of disease spreading across the water. I had told her politely that the lake was private property and not subject to HOA rules. She had blinked once, smiled a little tighter, and said the community would be reviewing that situation. Standing there now, staring at cloudy water and a brand new sign claiming HOA control, I realized something important. Linda Whitmore had not come down here this morning expecting me to notice anything unusual. Whoever dumped those chemicals probably thought they were solving a simple problem. Ruin the fishing, make the lake unpleasant, pressure the stubborn landowner to give up access. It was a neat little plan on paper. The only issue was that Linda Whitmore believed this lake was just scenery behind the neighborhood. She believed it was my water, and that belief was about to cause a very big problem for Willow Creek Estates. By the time the sun cleared the tree line, I already knew this was not something that had drifted in from a rainstorm or farm runoff. The smell alone told me that. Chemicals leave a different signature in the air, something sharp that settles in the back of your throat and lingers long after the wind moves on. I walked the length of the shoreline until I reached the old pump shed sitting halfway down the western bank. It was a small concrete structure with a rust-colored metal door that had been there since the early 1980s. Most people in Willow Creek Estates probably drove past it every day without giving it a second thought. To them, it looked like some forgotten utility building left behind from the farm days. To me, it was the quiet little secret that made this entire neighborhood possible. I brushed a bit of dust off the faded warning sign bolted to the door. The lettering had worn thin over the years, but it was still readable if you knew where to look. County Water Access Station. I could still hear my father explaining it to me the first time he unlocked the door and showed me the pipes inside. Back in 1982, the county had expanded the municipal water system out toward the western hills. Running a deep well for every future neighborhood would have cost a fortune, so they made a deal with my grandfather instead. The lake already held more water than any reservoir within 20 miles, fed by natural runoff and a spring line running beneath the clay. The county installed intake pipes beneath the surface, built a small filtration station down the road, and connected the entire thing to the town supply grid. My grandfather signed the agreement on one condition. The lake would remain private property, protected from development or public recreation. The county got a reliable water source. My family kept ownership of the land. It was the kind of handshake agreement people used to make when a man's word still meant something. I stepped around the shed and followed the narrow service path until I reached the spot where the intake line disappeared beneath the water. Normally, you could see the dark outline of the pipe cage about 15 feet offshore. Today, the water was cloudy enough that the metal structure looked like a shadow under frosted glass. I stood there for a long moment, letting the realization settle in. The Homeowners Association had not just damaged a lake. They had contaminated the very place their drinking water began. Somewhere inside those identical houses with their trimmed hedges and decorative mailboxes, families were pouring glasses of water from kitchen faucets connected to the same system that started right here. I imagine Linda Whitmore standing in her spotless kitchen with polished granite counters and stainless steel appliances, filling a glass without the slightest idea where that water traveled before reaching her sink. The strange part was that none of this information was hidden. County records showed the agreement clearly. Utility maps marked the intake line running from the lake to the treatment station less than half a mile away. Anyone who bothered to spend 15 minutes at the courthouse could find it. But people like Linda rarely check records when they are convinced they already know the answer. I turned back toward the dock where the new sign still stood bright against the grass. The breeze had picked up just enough to push a faint ripple across the gray surface of the water. Whoever dumped those chemicals had probably gone home feeling satisfied, thinking they had finally forced the stubborn fisherman to give up his lake. They thought they had taken control of the situation. What they had actually done was far more interesting. Because the moment the county tested this water and traced the contamination back to its source, Willow Creek Estates was going to discover a very uncomfortable truth about the lake they tried to ruin. I did not call anyone right away. Most people would have picked up the phone immediately, but I have lived around land and water long enough to know that rushing never helps you understand what really happened. Instead, I walked back to the dock and studied the shoreline the way my grandfather taught me when I was a kid tracking cattle through the hills. The grass near the edge had been flattened in two long arcs, like something heavy had been dragged toward the water during the night. The clay soil along the bank held impressions that were still damp from the early morning dew. Tire tracks. Not the narrow pattern you would see from a pickup truck either. These were wide utility tires, the kind used on maintenance carts or landscaping trailers. The kind of equipment the homeowners association kept in their maintenance shed near the entrance gate. I followed the marks along the bank until they curved back toward the gravel service road that ran behind the line of cedar trees. The gravel there was disturbed in a way that made the story even clearer. Someone had backed a small trailer close to the shoreline, unloaded containers of something, and poured it directly into the lake. The breeze carried the chemical smell across the water again. And for a moment, I imagined the conversation that probably happened before sunrise while the neighborhood still slept. Someone from the homeowners association standing here with a clipboard and a flashlight, convinced they were solving a problem. Maybe Linda Whitmore herself was involved. I could almost hear her voice explaining how the lake needed to be brought under community standards. To her, the lake was an inconvenience. A patch of water that encouraged fishing boats and tackle boxes that did not match the carefully managed appearance of Willow Creek Estates. To me, it was the center of a system that had kept this entire valley supplied with water for decades. I reached down and scooped a small jar of water from the surface, screwing the lid tight before slipping it into my jacket pocket. A sample would be useful later. Not because I needed proof for myself, but because the county water authority definitely would. The old pump shed hummed quietly behind me, the intake pipes drawing water through. Filters that were never designed to handle something like this. That hum used to be comforting. It meant the system was working, the same quiet rhythm that had been there since the early 1980s. Now it sounded different somehow, like a machine waiting for someone to notice something had gone very wrong. I stood there for another minute looking out across the lake toward the rows of houses rising above the eastern ridge. Morning sunlight was reflecting off kitchen windows and parked cars, the normal peaceful look of a suburban neighborhood starting its day. Somewhere inside those houses, people were probably filling coffee makers and rinsing breakfast dishes, completely unaware that the water running through their pipes had passed through the same lake someone tried to sabotage during the night. I brushed a bit of dirt off my hands and started walking back toward the house. There was no need for shouting or arguing with the homeowners association. Situations like this do not get solved with loud voices. They get solved with records, evidence, and the right phone call placed at the right time. By the time I reached the back porch, I had already decided exactly who that call needed to go to. Because once the county water authority tested this lake and traced the contamination back to where it started, the homeowners association was going to realize something very important. They had not just interfered with a private fishing spot. They had interfered with the water supply that kept their entire neighborhood running. I made the call from the kitchen table while the morning sun crept through the blinds and stretched across the old wood floor. The number for the county water authority had not changed in years. I knew that because my father had written it on the inside cover of a faded binder that still sat in the cabinet above the refrigerator. The binder held every document related to the lake going back 40 years. Permits, inspection reports, water agreements. even the original map showing where the intake pipe ran beneath the surface. My father believed in keeping records the same way other people keep insurance policies. Quiet protection for the day something went wrong. When the line clicked and someone answered, I introduced myself and explained exactly what I had found that morning. I described the cloudy water, the chemical smell, and the intake point sitting less than 20 yards from where the contamination appeared strongest. The woman on the phone grew very quiet as I talked. I could hear the sound of typing in the background, the steady rhythm of someone pulling up files on a computer screen. Then she asked the question I expected. She asked if the lake was the Carter Reservoir listed in the county supply system. I told her yes. There was a pause long enough that I could imagine her turning to someone else in the office and repeating what she had just heard. When she came back on the line, her voice sounded very different. Calm, but sharp with concern. She said a field team would be sent immediately to collect samples and inspect the intake structure. I told her I already had a water sample sealed in a jar. She thanked me and said to keep it untouched until the inspectors arrived. The call lasted less than 5 minutes. After that, I stepped back outside and sat down on the edge of the dock where the boards were warm from the rising sun. The lake looked even stranger in the bright daylight. A faint film drifted across the surface near the western bank, swirling slowly in patterns that reminded me of oil floating on rainwater. Every few minutes a small ripple would spread across the lake, where something moved beneath the cloudy surface. Normally that sound meant fish chasing insects near the reeds. Today it sounded hollow and distant. Across the ridge I could see the rooftops of Willow Creek Estates catching the morning light. A school bus rolled slowly down the neighborhood entrance road and stopped near the mailbox cluster while a few kids climbed aboard with backpacks hanging off their shoulders. Everything about the scene looked ordinary. Quiet suburban life starting another weekday morning. Lawns trimmed, sprinklers ticking softly, coffee brewing in kitchens behind closed windows. No one in those houses knew that the water running through their pipes came from the lake sitting behind my property line. No one knew that sometime during the night someone had poured chemicals into that water with the confidence of people who believed they were only ruining a fishing spot. I rested my hands on the weathered railing and listened to the gentle hum from the old pump shed down the bank. That sound would not last much longer. Once the county inspectors tested the lake and saw what had been introduced into the water supply, the system would be shut down immediately. That was standard procedure in every municipal safety manual ever written. Intake closed. Pumps halted. Distribution paused until contamination could be isolated. It was not punishment. It was simply how water safety worked. And when that happened, every faucet in Willow Creek Estates would tell the same story at the same time. The Homeowners Association had tried to control a lake they did not understand. And now the consequences of that decision were already on their way down the road in a county inspection truck. The county truck arrived just after 9 in the morning, rolling slowly down the gravel access road with the steady crunch of tires that carried across the quiet water. I could hear it before I saw it, the sound echoing off the trees the same way it used to when farm equipment moved through the valley years ago. The vehicle stopped near the pump shed and 2 inspectors stepped out wearing reflective vests and carrying metal sampling cases that clicked softly when they set them on the ground. One of them introduced himself as Mark Sullivan, Senior Field Inspector for the County Water Authority. His handshake was firm but brief, the kind of greeting people give when they already understand the seriousness of what they are about to investigate. I handed him the sealed jar I had collected earlier that morning and explained exactly where the contamination appeared strongest along the shoreline. Mark unscrewed the lid just enough to catch the scent, and his expression tightened immediately. He did not need a laboratory to recognize that something in the water did not belong there. The 2 inspectors walked the edge of the lake slowly, placing small sample bottles into the cloudy surface and labeling each one with the time and location. The quiet routine of their work made the whole situation feel strangely calm, like a medical examination happening in slow motion. After a few minutes, Mark crouched near the bank and studied the tire tracks pressed into the damp clay. He traced one of the impressions with his finger, measuring the width between the grooves. Then he looked up toward the ridge where the houses of Willow Creek Estates stood in neat rows above the tree line. The direction of the tracks pointed straight toward the neighborhood service road that maintenance crews used to reach the storm drainage culverts. When he stood again, his voice carried the steady tone of someone who had seen this kind of problem before. He said the intake system would have to be shut down immediately until the contamination could be analyzed and the source confirmed. That was standard safety protocol whenever a municipal water supply was compromised. I nodded because I already knew that was coming. Mark walked over to the pump shed and unlocked the control panel mounted on the outside wall. The low mechanical hum that had been running quietly all morning stopped with a soft click as he powered down the intake pumps. For the first time in decades, the Carter Lake system was no longer feeding water into the county pipeline. The sudden silence felt heavier than I expected, like the valley itself had paused to listen. Mark wrote something on a clipboard and then spoke into a handheld radio, calmly informing the main office that the intake station was temporarily offline due to suspected chemical contamination. Within minutes, the confirmation came back through the static. Distribution to Willow Creek Estates would be suspended until further notice while the Water Authority completed a full environmental assessment. I leaned against the railing of the dock and looked across the lake toward the neighborhood again. The houses still looked peaceful under the clear blue sky. Sprinklers rotated across freshly cut lawns, and a delivery truck moved slowly along the street dropping packages on front porches. Nothing about the scene suggested that anything had changed. But somewhere inside those homes someone would eventually walk to a sink, turn a faucet handle, and notice that the familiar stream of water was suddenly gone. And when the homeowners association began asking questions about why their water supply had stopped without warning, the answer would lead them right back to the lake they tried to control. It did not take long for the first sign of trouble to reach the neighborhood. Around mid-morning, the quiet rhythm of Willow Creek Estates began to shift in small ways that were easy to miss unless you were looking directly at them. A lawn sprinkler near the entrance gate sputtered once and then stopped completely, the rotating head freezing in place like a clock that had suddenly forgotten how to tick. A few minutes later, another sprinkler further up the street did the same thing. I could see the pattern from the dock where I sat watching the lake. The water system feeding those houses had been running on pressure stored inside the distribution pipes, and once that reserve drained away, the entire network would fall silent. Mark Sullivan noticed it too. He stood near the pump shed finishing his inspection notes when he glanced up toward the ridge. One corner of his mouth lifted slightly in the quiet recognition of someone watching a system respond exactly the way engineering manuals say it should. The pumps were off, the intake line was sealed, and now the neighborhood that depended on that supply was beginning to feel the effect. The first vehicle appeared about 20 minutes later. A white homeowners association maintenance cart rolled slowly down the service road, its small electric motor humming across the gravel. The driver looked confused before he even stepped out. He walked toward the pump shed and glanced at the silent control panel, like someone checking a machine that had stopped making noise without explanation. Mark greeted him calmly and explained that the water intake had been temporarily suspended due to a contamination investigation. The man listened for a moment and then looked across the lake toward the cloudy surface, his expression shifting from confusion to something closer to concern. He thanked Mark quietly and drove back toward the neighborhood, the cart disappearing between the rows of cedar trees that lined the ridge. The valley grew quiet again for a while. The inspectors continued their methodical work collecting samples while the lake drifted under the steady sunlight of late morning. The faint chemical smell still hung in the air, though the breeze had begun to carry it away from the shoreline. Around 11 o'clock, a different vehicle appeared at the top of the hill. A pearl white sport utility vehicle stopped near the service road entrance and remained there for several seconds before turning slowly onto the gravel path that led down toward the pump shed. Even from a distance, I recognized the shape of the vehicle and the careful way it moved along the narrow road. Linda Whitmore stepped out the moment it stopped. Her posture was straight and controlled, the same confident stance she used whenever she delivered one of her neighborhood compliance speeches. But the expression on her face was different from the tight smile I remembered from our last conversation. This time her eyes moved quickly between the inspectors, the silent pump shed, and the cloudy surface of the lake behind my dock. She approached Mark first, asking questions in a tone that tried to sound calm, while something sharper edged through the words. Mark answered in the same steady voice he had used all morning, explaining that the Water Authority had identified possible chemical contamination at the intake point and that the system feeding Willow Creek Estates had been shut down as a precaution. Linda stood very still while he spoke, her attention drifting briefly toward the lake where the cloudy water reflected the bright sky. For the first time since she had started trying to control the lake behind my property, it looked like she was beginning to understand exactly how important that water had always been. The conversation between Linda Whitmore and the county inspector lasted only a few minutes, but the change in her expression told the entire story. At first, she spoke with the calm confidence of someone who believed she was dealing with a routine misunderstanding. She asked why the pumps were turned off and how long the interruption would last. Mark Sullivan answered her questions patiently, explaining that the intake line connected to the lake had shown signs of chemical contamination and that the Water Authority was required by law to suspend distribution until laboratory tests confirmed the system was safe again. The words were simple and direct, but their meaning settled over the ridge like a slow-moving storm cloud. Linda's eyes shifted toward the lake again, this time studying the cloudy surface more carefully. For a moment, she looked as if she was trying to assemble pieces of information that had never occurred to her before. She asked another question, this one quieter. She wanted to know exactly which neighborhoods depended on this intake line. Mark glanced down at his clipboard and read the answer without any emotion. Willow Creek Estates. All phases. Full residential supply. Linda did not respond immediately. The breeze lifted a few strands of her hair as she looked back toward the hill where the houses stood in careful rows above the trees. Down there, the effects of the shutdown were becoming easier to notice. A homeowner near the edge of the neighborhood stepped out onto his driveway and stared at a garden hose that hung limp beside the garage. Further up the street, a pair of neighbors stood near the mailbox cluster, talking with the uneasy gestures people use when something unexpected interrupts their normal routine. The quiet suburban rhythm that had filled the morning was slowly unraveling. Mark finished writing the time of shutdown on his inspection report and clipped the pen back into his pocket. He explained that the Water Authority would continue testing the lake until they identified the substance responsible for the contamination and determined how it had entered the reservoir. If the chemical analysis confirmed that the pollution had been introduced intentionally, the case would likely move beyond the county water department and into a formal environmental investigation. Linda listened to those words without interrupting. Her posture had changed slightly, the confident stiffness in her shoulders replaced by a stillness that looked more like calculation than authority. She glanced once toward the tire tracks pressed into the clay near the shoreline, then toward the bright white sign standing beside my dock that declared the lake under Homeowners Association control. For the first time since she arrived, her attention moved across the water to where I stood leaning quietly against the railing. I did not say anything. I simply watched the sunlight ripple across the cloudy surface of the lake, while the breeze carried the faint chemical smell toward the trees. After a moment, Linda turned back to the inspector and asked if there was anything the Homeowners Association needed to do. Mark answered calmly that the most important step was to allow the investigation to proceed without interference. The Water Authority would determine exactly what had happened and how the contamination entered the reservoir. Until then, the intake system would remain offline. The explanation was professional and neutral, but the message behind it was impossible to miss. The Homeowners Association had spent months trying to control a lake they believed was just scenery behind their neighborhood. Now the entire community was beginning to discover that the water they depended on every single day had always come from the place they tried to ruin. By early afternoon, the valley felt different. The quiet mechanical rhythm that normally fed water into Willow Creek Estates had been replaced by the slow movement of investigation. Another county vehicle arrived carrying additional testing equipment, and the inspectors moved carefully along the shoreline collecting deeper samples from the intake area. The cloudy surface of the lake still carried that faint chemical scent, though the wind had begun pushing it farther down the valley. I remained on the dock watching the work unfold while the neighborhood above the ridge slowly realized something had changed. More cars appeared along the service road. A few residents stepped out of their vehicles near the edge of the trees, looking down toward the pump shed with the uncertain curiosity of people trying to understand why their faucets had suddenly gone quiet. Word travels fast in a place where every house shares the same water line. Someone must have called the Homeowners Association office because the maintenance cart returned again, followed by another vehicle from the neighborhood board. Conversations started forming in small clusters along the gravel path. Concerned voices, confused questions, the quiet tension of people discovering that something they depended on every day had stopped working. Linda Whitmore stood near the pump shed during most of it, speaking occasionally with the inspectors, but mostly watching the lake with a tight stillness in her posture. The confident authority she usually carried around the neighborhood had faded into something more cautious. At one point, she walked a few steps closer to the shoreline and studied the cloudy water where the intake pipe disappeared beneath the surface. From where I stood, I could see the moment when the realization settled fully into place. The lake she had tried to control was not simply a piece of scenery behind the neighborhood. It was the beginning of the system that kept the entire subdivision running. Mark Sullivan finished labeling another sample bottle and placed it carefully into a padded case. He explained to the small group gathered nearby that the Water Authority would continue testing until they identified the exact substance introduced into the reservoir and determined how it entered the lake. The results would be documented and reviewed by environmental safety officials, and once the source of the contamination was confirmed, the proper legal channels would handle the rest. His tone remained calm and professional, the same steady voice he had used since the moment he arrived that morning. The sun had begun drifting toward the western hills by the time the inspectors packed their equipment. The lake's surface looked slightly clearer now that the wind had moved some of the film away from the intake area, though the investigation was far from finished. As the county vehicles prepared to leave, Linda Whitmore finally turned toward me across the dock. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The breeze carried the quiet sounds of the valley between us, the rustle of cedar branches, and the distant murmur of people talking along the service road. Then her eyes moved once more across the lake toward the silent pump shed and the intake line beneath the water. That was when I spoke, keeping my voice calm the way my grandfather always did when explaining something obvious. I told her there was a reason my family had protected that lake for nearly 60 years. Water has a way of connecting everything around it. And sometimes the people who try to control it forget one very simple truth. The same water you try to ruin is often the water you end up needing the most.